scratching it, you would scratch it. And maybe you do it while you were asleep, right? And that is what happens to people with severe addiction. That balance is essentially broken. Homeostasis does not get restored despite sustained abstinence. They're living with that constant specter of that pull. It never goes away. So let me say there are lots of people with addiction for whom that does go away, and it goes away at 4 weeks for many of them. But in severe cases, that's always there and it's lingering. And it's the moment when they're not focusing on not using, it's like a reflex. They fall back into it. It's not purposeful. It's not because they want to get high. It's not because they value using drugs more than they do their family. None of that. It's that really they cannot not do it when given the opportunity and that moment when they're not thinking about it. Does that make sense?
That's a great description. And actually in that description, I can feel a bit of empathy because the way you describe scratching an itch in your sleep.
Yeah.
You know, I've done that with mosquito bites in summer. You're scratching, and you're like, oh, you wake up scratching that mosquito bite. And I also have to admit that I've experienced not feeling like I want to pick up my phone because it's so rewarding, but just finding myself doing it.
Yes, of course.
Like, I'm not going to use this thing. I'm not going to use this thing.
Right.
And then just finding myself doing it. Like, what am I doing here?
Right.
Sort of how did I get back here again?
Right.
And I know enough about brain function to understand that we have circuits that generate deliberate behavior and we have circuits that generate reflexive behavior. And one of the goals of the nervous system is to make the deliberate stuff reflexive so you don't have to make the decision, because decision making is a very costly thing to do.
Exactly.
Decision making of any kind.
Right. Right.
So that does really help. I want to just try and weave together this this dopamine puzzle, however, because if by week, so first phase of this 30 or 40 day detox, it's like a dopamine fast. Right. Okay. First 10 days are miserable. Middle 10 days, the clouds are out. There may be some shards of sunlight coming through. And then all of a sudden, sun starts to come out. It gets brighter and brighter. Why is it then that people will relapse, not just after getting fired from a job or their spouse leaving them, but when things are going really well?
Yes.
Is it this unconscious mechanism? Because I've seen this before, is they have a great win. I have a friend who's a really impressive creative. I don't want to reveal any more than that, but and relapsed upon getting another really terrific opportunity to create for the entire world. And I was like, how can that happen? But now I'm beginning to wonder, was it the dopamine associated with that win that opened the spigot on this dopamine system? Because it happened in a phase of a really great stretch of life.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So you raised that great point about triggers, right? And triggers are things that make us want to go back to using our drug. And the key thing about triggers, whatever they are, is they also release a little bit of dopamine, right? So just thinking about whatever the trigger is that we associate with drug use, or just thinking about drug use, can already release this anticipatory dopamine, this little mini spike. But here's the part that I think is really fascinating. That mini spike is followed by a mini deficit state. So it goes up and then it doesn't go back down to baseline. It goes below baseline tonic levels. And that's craving, right? So that anticipation is immediately followed by wanting the drug. And it's that dopamine deficit state that drives the motivation to go and get the drug. So many people talk about dopamine is not really about pleasure, but about wanting and about motivation. And so it is that deficit state that then drives the locomotion to get it.
And earlier, your description of dopamine being involved in the desire for more, giving the sense of reward, but also movement.
Right.
I have to assume that those things are braided together in our nervous system for the specific intention of when you feel something good, then you feel the pain. Or maybe you don't notice it. And then the next thing you know, you're pursuing more of the thing that.
And I love the way you use the word braided together. That's beautiful. And let me also just say something that I find also fascinating in my work with patients. And I see this all the time. There are people for whom bad life experiences, loss, in any form, stress in many different forms, that's a trigger. But there are absolutely people for whom The trigger is things going well. And the things going well can be like the reward of the things going well, but very often what it is the removal of the hypervigilant state that's required to keep their use in check. So it's this sense of, I want to celebrate, or this reward happened. I want to put more reward on there. And it's really, really fascinating because when people come to that realization about themselves, that they're most vulnerable when things are going well, that's really a valuable insight because then they can put some, things in place or barriers in place or go to more meetings or whatever it is that they do, to protect themselves.
Along those lines, I have a friend, 40 years sober, was a severe drug and alcohol addict from a very young age, a really impressive person, does a lot of important work in the kind of at-risk youth community out in Hawaii. And he said something to me. He said, as former addicts often do, they got these great sayings. But I think it fits very well with what you're describing. He said, no matter how far you drive, you're always the same distance from the ditch. And I said, well, that's kind of depressing. And he said, no, that's actually what gives me peace.
Yeah.
Because what would happen is for so many years of relapsing, recovering and relapsing, he felt like it was hopeless. And then somehow conceptualizing that the vigilance can never go away, instead of making him feel burdened.
Yeah.
It made him feel relieved. So I often think about that statement, no matter how far you drive, you're always the same distance from the ditch. Because in my mind, I conceptualize that as, gosh, that's a tough way to drive down the road. But actually, on a road where you know where the ditch is and where you know where the lane lines are, it's actually a pretty nice drive. It's when you don't know where the shoulder is that you constantly have to be looking around. So there's this, we're speaking now in analogies and imagery, and science. But one of the things I find so incredible about this community of 12-step, and there are a variety of them, are the communities that they create for themselves. And some of these sayings, which I do believe link back to really core biological mechanisms.
Yes. Yes.
I do want to ask about those communities. I have a question which might be a little bit controversial.
Great.
Which is it possible that people who were addicted to drugs or alcohol or some gambling or some other behavior get addicted to the addiction community? Because one thing that I think I observe over and over is that there's some circuit in the brain of human beings that has to tell you about the dream they had the night before, for whatever reason. There's another circuit that leads people to wake you up if they themselves can't sleep. I don't know what circuit is. I'm being facetious here. But there does seem to also be a circuit in the brain of addicts to discuss and want to kind of talk about their recovery a lot. And I mention this not to poke at them, but rather the opposite, because I think that one thing that is challenging, at least for me and having friends that have a propensity for drug or alcohol addiction, not all of them, but certainly some of them, is when they're talking about their recovery, I feel like it's all they talk about. This meeting, that meeting, that meeting. How are we, so what I'm really asking here is that can we become addicted to sobriety?
Right. So this is a great question, and it links into some of the other things we've been talking about, having to do with where do we settle out? What is the way to live between pleasure and pain? And I implied earlier that ultimately we want a resilient balance that's sensitive to pleasure and pain, but that can easily restore homeostasis after we indulge, even when we indulge greatly. But the truth of the matter is that people with severe addiction, I believe, temperamentally want those extremes, and they're wired for that kind of intensity that is more than just these slight adjustments around the fulcrum, right? It's like they want the big highs and the big lows.
They'll say great meeting.
Yeah, right.
They're like, that was such an amazing meeting. Or they find a group.
Yeah.
They find a group in a location.
Yeah.
Like this is almost an inside joke in those communities. Again, I'm not talking about a friend in quotes. This isn't me reporting. Well, they'll talk about how attractive people are at a given meeting, or how bonded they feel to people at a given meeting, that the meetings themselves become their own form of dopamine hit.
Yes.
And again, I'm not being disparaging.
Yeah.
I want to understand this.
Right. So yes. So a lot of times patients will say to me, "Oh, I don't want to go to AA. It's a cult." And my response to that is, because it's a cult is exactly why it works. Okay.
Right.
Because yes, it is much better for you to be addicted to AA and to recovery than almost any other addiction I could think of. And we know from Rob Malenka's work, who's here at Stanford, that oxytocin, is the hormone that's involved in human pair bonding and relationships and love. And it directly links to dopamine neurons and causes the release of dopamine. So yes, when we connect with other humans, especially in a kind of transcendent spiritual way, that's a huge dopamine hit. And it does replace the dopamine that people get from drugs. And for people who have this addiction temperament, they need it on a more intense level. They're not going to be generally satisfied with kind of, a sort of acquaintanceship, right? They want that intensity of the intimacy that you get with people when you're cathartically exposing, warts and all. So yes, people can get addicted to recovery, and good for them. Go for it, and of course this can be disruptive for friendships and relationships where the one person is not in recovery. Like, you're going to so many meetings, you're always talking about recovery, but you know what? Much better than them being intoxicated, right? I mean, so although you may tire of your friends talking about their meetings all the time, I'm sure you would rather have them do that than be in their addiction. So
yeah, absolutely. And this is now the second time you've done this during this discussion, but now I have empathy because the way you describe their enthusiasm about meetings is probably the way that people feel about me and your work.
Right.
And in neuroscience, I mean, I've been getting up in front of the class since I was 8 years old and talking about things I read over the weekend. Now I just happen to have this thing called a podcast.
Right.
I've been doing it since I was little, and it annoys a lot of people. Right. I've learned to suppress it a little bit. Some people like it, but I'm poking fun at myself just to say that I now can understand that the way I feel about their reports about yet another amazing meeting, or there's a different form of this, but there's some people for which they just love intense experiences.
Yes.
They're always like trying to pull me off to Bali because they're talking about how sensual it is all the time. I'm sure Bali's wonderful, but there's this kind of ratcheting up. It's like seeking Burning Man all year long. I've never been to Burning Man, no desire to go to Burning Man. But inside of academia, I mean, if I were to just turn the mirror at myself, inside of academia or here in Silicon Valley, work and the pursuit of more success, even if money is kind of divorced from that, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. Academic work is, for sake of pursuit of knowledge. It sounds to me like the same mechanism. In fact, it feels to me very much like the same mechanism.
So Andrew, here's what I love about you. First of all, you're willing to bring your own flaws and foibles to this conversation.
Well, they're everywhere.
Well, you know what? It's wonderful. And then you're really open and curious and wanting to understand, because I can't tell you how many people I have met who really see addiction as some kind of otherness. But the truth is, we're all wired for addiction. And if you're not addicted yet, it's right around the corner. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Especially with the incredible panoply of new drugs and behaviors that are out there. So I love that you're willing to take a moment and really try to understand this, because it is, we can all relate, and you're relating it to essentially your work addiction is right and apt. You just happen to be addicted to something that is really socially rewarded. You figured that out at an early age. Oh, when I do X, Y, and Z, all these people go, look at that smart kid, or whatever it is,
Well, for me, it made me feel safe.
Okay.
I felt like, I just felt like this, and I paused there because it's like peace. I'm like, I can relax for a moment.
When you're talking about neuroscience.
No, or just when I feel like I'm on the right path.
Yeah.
And I'm onto something, or if I see something that I'm excited about.
Right.
I'm like, I feel filled with, it must be dopamine.
Yes.
I feel flooded with pleasure, literally from head to toe.
Yeah.
And then my next thought is more.
So true. You're a true addict.
Okay.
You are.
Thank you.
You are,
okay.
But you just got really,
thank you.
You really got lucky with the fact that what you're drawn to is adaptive, essentially, and then your challenge is going to be that your life doesn't get too out of balance in the sense that you're 24/7 work and you don't stop and do some other things or think of other.
And my life admittedly is somewhat asymmetric. I mean, it has other components of physical health, et cetera, but it is somewhat asymmetric. Which is why I got a dog. Although I talk about him an awful lot. So,
but the dog is good because that draws you out of yourself and a little bit away from the work. But again, I think the key here is for people who feel like they've never experienced addiction, or they don't know anybody with addiction, or if they do, they don't get it. Just think of that one thing that is the most important thing in your life that you do that gives you pleasure and meaning and purpose. And then imagine if you couldn't do it.
Oh yeah, let's not talk about that.
Right.
Well, I appreciate the feedback, and you can send me a bill at the end. What is the most ridiculous sounding addiction that you've ever witnessed that was actually a real addiction along these lines? Because I think we all know the standard heroin pill. You've been I should mention, because it's important, your previous book, and we will provide a link to that as well, focused on the opioid crisis and what we thought was medication turned out to be just as bad, if not worse, than a lot of so-called street drugs. So we understand those gambling, sex addiction, porn addiction, now video games. We'll talk about social media a little bit more in depth. But what's the most wow, I didn't realize people could get addicted to that?
Water.
Really?
Really. So I had a very lovely patient who had a severe alcohol addiction, and she got into recovery from her alcohol addiction for many years, but she kind of had a sort of a polydipsia, or an urge to be drinking something a lot. And so she drank a lot of water, and slowly over time, she realized that if she drank enough water, she could become hyponatremic and delirious and be out of herself.
You can die from it, right?
Right, which is what she just wanted to be out of her own head. And so she would periodically intentionally overdose on water in order, to, I know it was so sad, so sad.
What happened to her?
She eventually took her own life.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really...
That's rough.
She was a lovely woman. She was so bright. She had so many interests and passions. And of course it was very sad when, when she died. But that was a wow to me. It was like, wow, if you have this disease of addiction, you can even get addicted to water.
Wow. And I think it just underscores the generalizability of these circuits.
Right.
There isn't a brain circuit for addiction to water that she happened to have. There's a brain circuit for pleasure and pain and addiction, and water plugged into that circuit. Right. Wow. That's intense. In your book, Dopamine Nation, you also describe some amazing paths to recovery. People that, from reading it, I won't say which ones and who, because there's some great surprises in the book too, both tragic and triumphant, as they say. You've often described your patients as your heroes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit more about that.
When you think about how hard it is to give up a drug or a behavior that you're addicted to, how much courage that takes, and fortitude and discipline and stick-to-itiveness. These people are really amazing people. I mean, I don't know that I could do it, what they do, and we talked a little bit about, just the constant, ever-present urge to use, even after sustained periods of abstinence for some people. That's really, really hard. And of course, then you double down on the shame that they feel because of that urge, even when their lives are so much better. I mean, these people are really, really remarkable. And you take their remarkable accomplishment, and then you imagine the world that we live in now, where we are constantly invited and tempted and really bombarded with opportunities to become addicted at every turn.
It's like feeling an itch everywhere.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you can't escape it. You cannot escape it. That you'll get an email in your inbox inviting you to do X, Y, or Z. And if you're addicted to that thing and, you tried to delete all your apps and not go here, all of a sudden your work inbox, you're getting those images, let's say, really, really, really hard. And yet these people find a way to do it. I think it's absolutely amazing. And they're really wise people. They have so much wisdom to offer. They've taught me a lot. You know, as I talk about in my book, I have my own addictions, and I really just like took a page right out of their book. I was like, okay, what do I do now? All right, what did this patient do? What did that? Okay, I'm going to try that.
It is an amazing community of the people that they are very sage. I wanted to just touch on something that you mentioned, which is the shame.
Yeah.
You know, you can't go to a meeting or talk to addicts without detecting or hearing about like lies, shame, etc. I heard you say in an interview with somebody else recently that truth telling and secrets are sort of at the core of recovery. And tell us more about that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found really fascinating about working with people in recovery was how telling the truth, even about the merest detail of their lives, was central to their recovery. And I became really curious about that. Like, why would truth telling be so important? And of course, there is the obvious thing that when people are in their addiction, they're lying about using, you know, so part of getting into recovery is to stop lying to the people they care about their use. But it's really more than that, because what people in recovery have taught me is that it's not even just not lying about using drugs. I have to not lie about anything. I can't lie about why I was late to work this morning, which we all do. Oh, I hit traffic. No, I didn't hit traffic. I wanted to spend 2 more minutes reading the paper and drinking my coffee, right? Or just lying about, you know, I don't know, where I had dinner. Like, so people with addiction will get into, you know, the lying habit where they're lying about random stuff because they're sort of in the habit of lying. And how recovery is really about telling the truth, you know, in all ways. And so one of the things that I had a lot of fun with in writing the book is sort of exploring the neuroscience around why truth telling is important to leading a balanced life. And we know like every religion since the beginning of time is all about telling the truth. Well, why, right? And there's really interesting neuroscience behind it that suggests that when we tell the truth, we actually potentially strengthen our prefrontal cortical circuits and their connections to our limbic brain and our reward brain. And of course, these are the circuits that get disconnected when we're in our addiction, right? Our balance in our reward pathway or limbic brain, our emotion brain is doing one thing, and our cortical circuits are completely disengaged from that, ignoring what's happening, which is easy to do because it's reflexive. We don't need to think about that balance for the balance to be happening. But we have to re-engage those circuits, anticipate future consequences, think through the drink, you know, not just how am I going to feel now if I use, but how am I going to feel tomorrow or 6 months from now? And that telling the truth is in fact a way to do that, to make these connections stronger. And I talk about some studies in my book that kind of indirectly show that. So I find that really fascinating. Plus, that like being open and honest with people really does create very intimate connections. And those intimate connections create dopamine. So we were talking a little bit about how you know a bunch of people who need like intensity in their lives. For me, I need a lot of intensity in my human connections. Like I'm really not interested in and bored by and made anxious by casual interactions. But, you know, like having this kind of discussion with you that's very intense and also intimate and self-disclosing is very rewarding for me. So that's an important source of dopamine. Thank God I became a psychiatrist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Right. Like I can't disclose all my stuff, but I am quite transparent with my patients, which is a slightly unorthodox. But you know, when I think it's right, I'm also transparent with them. So that's a source of dopamine too, when we're honest and we disclose, and that you think people are going to run away from you if you tell them about all like your weird neuroses, but really they don't. What they're like is, oh, thank God, I'm not the only one. Mm-hmm. Right.
Well, what I love many things about your book. I read it in one sweep.
Oh, thank you.
And I was like, wow, I was pleasantly surprised, but I was like, wow, she's really opening up in this book from the very beginning. Yeah. And I don't want to give it away, but it's, you're very open where it's appropriate. And also I think that this question about truth telling, I always think about like, tell the truth be, 100% about the truth. But there's also this element about, do you report previous lies, right? Like what about prior behavior? And I'm fascinated by this because to me, telling the truth has many facets, but the three sides of this thing in my mind are, one is reporting everything accurately. The other is, what do you withhold? What do you not withhold? Right? Because some people say, tell the truth or at least don't lie. That's sort of a
lies of omission.
That's
right?
a lies of omission. Lies of omission. And then there's what I have to assume for most people is a small to enormous batch of things that they lied about in the past that still thread into the future.
Right.
So how important is it for the addict or every person really to, because it sounds like cultivating the circuitry between prefrontal cortex and the dopamine system would be great for anybody. Since we're all addicts, everyone should do it. But in all seriousness, that sounds like a good thing for everybody to do. How much work needs to be done on all the priors, all the stuff we've hidden, and I mean, not me, but all the stuff that everybody else has hidden.
Yeah. So the steps of the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous, a good number of those steps are about that very thing, the past, the ways that we've harmed people in the past. And the fourth step is about making amends, by admitting the ways in which that we've contributed to harming others. And it is a really big piece of recovery. So, how important, so for people with addiction, it's really, really important to go back and make amends. And, the key idea there is you just go back and you apologize, and you don't have to get any particular kind of response, or you don't need to be forgiven. It's the act itself of apologizing about the ways in which we've harmed or lied to people in the past that is cathartic and renewing and allows us to kind of shed this skin and be new in our lives and begin again, sort of absolved, of past sins, so to speak. So it is really important. Are there situations when it's maybe not a good idea because of that person or the nature? Sure. There are always going to be, it doesn't have to be like, we're talking about not like Kant's idea about like never lie, but robbers in your house and you're stowaway. You can't lie even about that. It's like, no, there are probably situations where,
for sake of other people's safety,
right.
Children's safety.
Right.
Sure.
Right. I mean, there, you can think of a million scenarios, but in general, when we're taking stock, because I don't know about you, but I have a lot of regrets and guilt about a lot of things in my life, and they kind of haunt me. Sometimes I'll have nightmares, right? And I think that's true for most people. I mean, I occasionally will meet somebody who's like, "Oh, I don't have any regrets in my life." I'm like, "Wow, like I cannot relate to that at all." So this idea of like catharsis and, well, I mean, in the 12 steps, it's telling God or your higher power, telling another human being the ways in which you've wronged others, considering your own character defects and how those have contributed. To me, that's a really important piece and something that we don't do enough in our current culture, especially in psychiatry, frankly, where there's a lot of eternally empathizing with patients, but not a whole lot of like going, well, actually, you kind of messed that up, or like, that was really bad on you, And in my work, I don't necessarily use that language, but, patients may say like, I really feel badly about, this thing. I'll be like, yeah, I get it. I understand that you feel.
Well, guilt is a
right.
There's a circuit for that too.
Right. And it's important, right? And it's also important to recovery and to not becoming addicted, is, experiencing a certain amount of appropriate shame for things that we have done, and, feeling the pain that comes with shame, which is an incredibly painful emotion, right? I mean, I think that may be the one that we all try to avoid more than any other, is like that shame of not being liked or not being accepted or not being celebrated.
The thing that we did is really despicable.
Right. It's really, like, oh my God, I did that horrible thing. Right. And then, so, I mean, I've done horrible things that I haven't gone back and said I did this horrible thing, but maybe I've tried to pay it forward. Like I've told my kids, when I was younger, I did this horrible thing and it still haunts me. So if you're ever tempted to do something like what I did, you might think about my situation. So, some kind of way, but I think wrestling with that is important.
I think it's a really important element to all this. And there's not, I love that there's neuroscience being done on truth telling and the value of truth telling. I think if I were to predict a new and truly exciting area that people are going to be really curious about, and in this huge sphere we call neuroscience, I hope they'll continue to do more work. Also speaks. I'm so glad to hear that's happening here at Stanford.
No, that's the literature that I look at isn't Stanford work, but there's work. It might be people at Stanford.
Regardless of where it's happening, more of that and all the rest, please. I want to ask you about using drugs to treat drug addiction. These days, there's a growing interest, or at least discussion, about ibogaine. People going out of country, because I think it's still illegal here, or is illegal here, going out of country to, either inject it or smoke it or whatever it is, or people going and doing ayahuasca journeys, or MDMA, which is still an illegal drug in this country, but there are clinical trials. There are people on this campus doing experimental studies. I don't know of clinical trials, but at Johns Hopkins, there are clinical trials, et cetera. So this is a vast area, right? Different chemistries for different drugs and different purposes. But the rationale, as I understand it, is take people who are in a pattern of addiction, launch them into a experience that's also chemical and extreme, often of the extreme serotonin and or extreme dopamine type. So MDMA, ecstasy, for instance, tons of serotonin dumped, tons of dopamine dumped. How neurotoxic, if neurotoxic, debatable, et cetera, et cetera. Not a topic for now, but a lot. And then somehow that extreme experience wrapped inside of a supported network in there, whether or not there's just someone there or whether or not they're actively working through something with the patient, is supposed to eject the person into a life where drug use isn't as much of interest. This violates at a purely rational level. This violates everything we've talked about in terms of dopamine biology. Yeah. It would, if this arrangement is the way I described it, cause more addiction. It is anything but a dopamine fast. It's a dopamine feast. So we hear about successful transitions through this, at least anecdotally, and maybe some clinical study. What is going on? What is going on? Doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah. So I think it's good that you're skeptical. I think we all should be skeptical. Having said that, there are clinical studies showing, and these are small studies and they're short duration, small number of subjects, but, taking people, for example, who are addicted to alcohol and then having them have this, let's say, psychedelic experience in a very controlled setting.
So either typically it's a high dose psilocybin or 3-dose, as I saw it for the MAP study of MDMA, of ecstasy. Those are sort of the kind of typical, bread and butter of this kind of work.
Right. Yeah. But the thing to really keep in mind is that this is completely interwoven with regular psychotherapy, and that these are highly selected individuals.
And clinical trials.
Right.
We're
and these
referring
are
to legal clinical trials.
Right. And so, I think the metaphor that helps me think about this is there are many ways to the top of the mountain, and these are sort of like taking the gondola instead of walking up. It's sort of, instead of doing like a year of psychoanalysis where you're sitting on the couch every week reflecting on your life, it's a condensed version of psychoanalysis or psychotherapy plus, MDMA, which gets you there faster.
Creates the intimacy, presumably, because of this.
Well, I think the main thing that happens when it's beneficial is it just allows the person to get outside of their own head and look at their lives on a much broader sweep, and to consider themselves not mired in the, quotidian sort of details of their life, but rather as a human on the large planet Earth in the vast universe. So I think it's like when it works, it's a transformational experience because it gives the person another lens through which to view their lives, which I think for some people is positive and powerful because they can come back from that and be like, oh my gosh, I care about my family and I want X, Y, or Z for them. And I realize that my continuing to drink is not going to, achieve that. So it's almost like a spiritual or values based. So I think it can be very powerful. But having said that, I truly am quite skeptical because, addiction is a chronic relapsing and remitting problem. It's hard for me to imagine that there's something that works very quickly short term that's going to work for a disease that's really long lasting.
Yeah, the two addicts I know that did MDMA assisted psychotherapy as part of this thing both got worse.
Yeah.
But the people I know who had severe trauma, who took this approach, seem to be doing better.
Okay, interesting.
And so I think that the discussion as we hear it now is just sort of psychedelics, which is a huge category that includes many different drugs and compounds with different effects. And we hear about trauma and addiction lumped together. Mm-hmm. And I think that I'm a splitter, not a lumper, as we say in science. And I think it's going to be important for people to know that this is definitely not a one size fits all kind of thing, but it sounds like it may have some utility under certain conditions.
Yeah, I think so. I think I'm trying to be very open-minded about its potential utility for certain individuals, but I can tell you in my clinical work, what is a very concerning unintended consequence of this narrative is I have a lot of people who are looking for some kind of spiritual awakening who on their own, not in the context of any kind of therapeutic psychological work, microdose or want to try, psilocybin or MDMA with a friend or wherever so they can have this, spiritual experience that they can figure out their lives. That's a disaster and almost never works out well. And I've then had people who literally, supposedly you can't get addicted to psychedelics because, something with the biochemistry, which I don't fully understand because it doesn't make any sense to me. But I have patients clinically who definitely are addicted to, MDMA, to microdosing. So that's very concerning to me because Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, I respect that work. But on the other hand, it's penetrated the culture.
Michael Pollan's book.
Yeah.
Well, and I don't know him, and so I don't have a problem taking a stance. So I'll just say my stance on that is the narrative of popular authors can expand and wick out so fast.
Yes.
That pretty soon people are essentially taking their mental health into their own hands.
Right.
And I have great optimism for this business of clinical use of psychedelics, including MDMA. Matthew Johnson at Johns Hopkins is doing fabulous work on this. And there are others too, of course, but those are controlled settings.
Right.
And the pharmacology is being tuned up. And one thing that I think is coming, there are several papers published recently in great journals like Nature and Science, et cetera, where there are scientists who are removing the hallucinogenic components of these drugs and finding that they still have the antidepressant effects. And so the experience of a psychedelic and the long-term effects of the psychedelic might actually be dissociable. Mm-hmm. And so again, and I'm always careful to say I'm neither for something or against it. I just think that treading carefully is what's important.
I agree with you. And I can just tell you that the downstream effect for the average person, for many of whom present in our clinic, is that they've misconstrued the data on the use of psychedelics for mental health conditions to this idea that they're safe or that anybody can take them in any circumstance and have this kind of awakening. And that's not what the data show, right? The data are these highly controlled settings, carefully selected patients. So that's my worry,
Sure. And I'm going to be sitting down with Matthew Johnson at some point, and we'll discuss this. And I think that that care and that cocoon of real clinical care does seem to be an important component. Well, I'm glad we could touch on it, and I'm sure I'll get a bunch of comments telling me that, but I think it is important to explore things from all sides, and that's what we do as scientists. And if Michael Pollan wants to chat, we can do that too. That's fine. I very much enjoyed the book, actually, but I think that people run with ideas.
That's right.
They don't walk with them; they sprint.
Right.
There are a couple other things I just want to touch on, but they all relate to social media.
Okay.
You were featured in The Social Dilemma. It was a powerful movie. I think many people have avoided seeing that movie because it reflects back on us just how addicted we all are and how manipulated we all are.
Yes.
But it doesn't seem to have changed behavior much. I have to say that the movie changed my understanding and my perception, but not my behavior too much. If we look at addiction as a maladaptive thing, something that's making our lives worse or us less functional at work and in relationships, I could imagine a version of social media where it's making me more connected. I mean, this is a podcast after all. I post videos. This will show up on YouTube and elements of it on Instagram as well. So much like sugar or other things, I have to imagine that we need to regulate, not necessarily eliminate this behavior. So I want to talk about what that looks like. And I want to talk about what you've referred to as this narcissistic preoccupation that social media is creating, that we are all far more keenly aware of how we look and how we sound and how we are being perceived than we were 10 years ago.
Right.
So first of all, social media, how addicting is it really? And what is healthy social media behavior?
So the first message I would want to get across about social media is that it really is a drug, and it's engineered to be a drug. And it's based on, potency, quantity, variety, the bottomless bowls, the likes, the way that it's enumerated, all of that, which doesn't mean that we can't use it. But we need to be very thoughtful about the way we use it, just like we need to be thoughtful about the way we use any drug. And so that means with intention and in advance, planning our use, right? And trying to use it as a really awesome tool to potentially connect with other people and not to be used by it, or get lost in it. And of course, people are going to come with different propensities for addiction to any drug, and that's true for social media too. Some people will have no problem using it in moderation or using it in a way that's adaptive, and other people will immediately get sucked in. And the key thing about getting addicted is when it's happening, we nobody who's getting addicted thinks they're getting addicted, right? Let's face it. It's only after the fact that we go, whoops, what was that about?
Well, remember texting and driving? There were all these books about texting and driving, how terrible it was.
Yeah.
Even the governments have largely given up. You see these billboards,
terrifying,
like don't text and drive, or any text can wait, or not worth dying for.
Right.
But everybody's texting and driving.
Right. And if you look at young people today, teenagers, they're basically cybernetically enhanced. That the phone is there, it's like they're talking to you and texting 12 friends at the same time. And there's no stopping it. The genie is out of the bottle where, we're not going back, So we do need to figure out, how to make this tool something that's, going to be good for us and not ultimately harmful. And I don't have all the answers by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think, some of the wisdom that we have learned from using other drugs also applies to social media, which is to say that we have to, again, put barriers in place that allow us to remain in control of our use, which means not too much, not too often, not too potent.
Do you think, in going back to this idea of the unit of the day being a good tractable unit, a manageable unit of time for most people? So you're saying in advance, so allocating 2 hours in which you're going to allow yourself to have free reign use of the phone and all its apps and all its things, or even more restricted than that, meaning, okay, I'm only going to allow myself 30 minutes a day to post and comment, and then that's a closeout completely.
Yeah, so I think it depends on the person, and it's sort of a combination. We talked earlier about, having an itch and scratching yourself at night. We've gotten to a point with smartphones, people are pulling them out and they are utterly unconscious of doing so. Pulling them out, a couple text, a couple swipe. They don't know they're doing it. I have a
friend who works in, delivers babies.
Yeah.
And many pregnant mothers won't actually deliver without their phone in hand. And this used to be the hand that was connected to their spouse. Yeah. This may be a comment on spouses more than on phones, but it sounds like it's a kind of a security blanket,
right? Like a transitional object. Yeah.
Actually, that reminds me. You've referred to the phone. I think it's the phone, but maybe it's our online persona or ourselves, as we've become sort of infantile. Mm-hmm. In our need for it. It's like a baby in a bottle.
Right.
And so I do wonder if we have regressed, and I do think we've regressed a bit in terms of our online behavior, our inability to act like, I always thought an adult was somebody that can control their behavior.
Yeah.
That's the difference between a baby and an adult. You don't have to be a developmental neurobiologist for very long to understand that a young organism can't control its behavior and an older one can. So to me, a mature organism, mature in years organism that can't control its behavior is a baby. It's an immature version of itself. And there's neuroscience to support that statement. I look at my own behavior with the phone sometimes and I think, I'm a grown man. Like, what is the problem here? Right. I don't eat baby food, but I'm acting like a baby with the phone. Right. All right. In the sense that I'm reflexively picking it up. I'm not being intentioned and deliberate with it. Do I need a full 30 days, Anna?
So 30
days away from my phone.
As you know, that's my recommendation, the full 30 days to reset. I think, if you're severely addicted, I recommend the 30 days. But if you're just a little bit addicted, like most of us, you probably don't need 30 days. In fact, a single day not only would be challenging, but probably maybe sufficient.
My phone is off for substantial segments of the day.
Okay, that's great.
And it drives other people crazy. People expect me to respond, but I don't care. I really don't.
Right.
And I actually take a little bit of pleasure in the fact that, because I think the point I'm trying to make is the right one, which is that it's not just right for me, but like why I don't see a clause on text messages or emails that say must be responded to within X amount of time or else.
Right.
Or else.
Yeah.
So I take the liberty of replying when I'm able to.
Yeah, that's right.
Or want to.
Right. But which touches on one of the big challenges about social media is that as more and more of us are spending more and more time on social media, we're divesting our libidinous energies, etc., from real life interactions. So that means even when we want to choose to not be online connecting, we go outside and there's no there, right? There's nobody else there. So I think our collective challenge, and it should be our mission, is to make sure that we are preserving and maintaining offline ways to connect with each other. Because if we don't do that, then we'll be very lonely, right? If we were not online. But if you have a tribe of folks that you can be with, none of whom are on their phones while you're together for that discrete amount of time, then it's wonderful and liberating and nobody's distracted. And I think that's really the key. And I think young people are figuring that out. They're trying to create these spaces or try to, let's say, instead of doing a dopamine fast by yourself, do it with your friends, right? Then there's the FOMO is less, the fear of missing out, because you're all doing the dopamine fast together. So these are some of the tricks that, we can come up with. But
I like that.
Yeah. Okay,
I like
good.
That. I have a home gym and I love working out. I just enjoy it and always have. And I don't allow my phone in my gym anymore.
Right.
And I live in an area where I don't get any reception, like 2 meters outside my door. So all my dog walks now are just with the dog, and they were boring as hell. I also have a bulldog. He doesn't like to walk. It's really slow. And it was so boring for a while.
Yes.
Because I was so used to taking calls while I would walk, and it's super efficient. Why wouldn't I do that?
Yeah.
The walks now some of my favorite part of the day.
Yeah, right.
Because, and if I were to get a call on one of those, or they brought reception to the area, I would be very dismayed.
Right.
So I can attest to this. And I don't think I'm a phone addict, but I do put work into regulating my phone
Yes. So
behavior.
this is the key. You have to, with intention, prior to being in that situation, think of literal physical and metacognitive barriers that you can put between yourself and your phone or whatever your drug is, to create these intentional spaces where you're not constantly interrupting yourself essentially and distracting yourself. Because I really do think, I think we talked just before we started with the interview, we're losing the ability to have a sustained thought, right? I mean, we get so far, and then you get to that point in the thought where it's a little bit hard to know what's coming next. And it's very easy to check your phone or check your email or look something up on, the internet. And then you never get that opportunity to finish that thought, which is really the source of creative energy and an original thought, right? You're not just reacting to
right, and something that could contribute to the world.
That's right.
I'm a big believer that you're either consuming or you are creating.
Right.
And there is, I should mention, it's important. I do believe in neutral time. I think sleep is great. I'm a big proponent of sleep, and I've talked a lot about it on the podcast. I care a lot about sleep. And not just for sake of performance. I actually just really like sleep. I think that being a constant consumer of visual information and information of all kinds can be a problem. But there's some really great sources of information on the internet.
Yes.
And I certainly benefit from the fact that those channels exist. Narcissistic preoccupation. Am I a narcissist?
First of all, there's healthy.
Or is the fact that I asked, does that take me out of? Would a narcissist never ask that question?
Oh yes, a highly sophisticated narcissist would know to do that.
I'm not very sophisticated.
So there's healthy narcissism, which means that we all invest our personal energies into things that we care about, and if our competence in that arena is threatened, we would all experience a narcissistic injury, and that's normal and healthy. But we are living in a narcissistic culture. I mean, that's not news, this preoccupation with individual achievement and individual self-worth and individual self-confidence. And I think all of that is just fueled by social media, where we're not just seeing ourselves, but we're seeing people's reactions to ourselves, and every single, thing we say or do, we get likes and this and that. It's really insidious, and it contributes, I think, ultimately to a lot of personal shame, because we're not really meant to be individuals bouncing around in the universe. We're social animals, and we're probably generally happiest, even for natural contrarians among us, when we're part of a tribe, right? And if we do too much to kind of separate ourselves from that tribe, I think that the brain's natural and instinctive corrective mechanism against that is self-loathing and shame. So, it's so ironic, because the culture tells us if we just achieve more, we'll like ourselves more. But the truth is actually the opposite, that I think when people get these pinnacles of personal achievement, you have things like the imposter syndrome or whatever,
Or you just, we're at Stanford, after all, a lot of high achievers here, right? Some phenomenal, amazing people like yourself and other colleagues of mine that just, I'm always in awe. Like, it's just amazing. Like, the mean is shifted so high. And also people who have amazing paths to get here, coming from very little, accomplishing so much. But it's also the pressure, right? The way that this career was described to me the day I got my job was, one colleague of mine, the late Ben Barris, said, "Welcome to schizophrenia, because you're never going to be able to complete anything without getting interrupted." That was partially true, although I've created buffers. And the other one, very successful scientist, a member of the National Academy, et cetera, said to me, just remember, it's pinball. You never win. The best you can do is just keep playing.
Yes.
And I thought, wow, okay. Okay. And then you just go.
Right.
But I think that as we achieve more, not just academics, of course, but as anyone achieves more, there's the relishing in the accomplishment. There's often the desire for more, but there's also the pressure of well, now I have to do this for the next 30 years, even though I love it. It's the pressure of, well, if the mountain is this high, then how do I get here and here and here? And then you start shoveling more dirt on so you can keep climbing. And it's a lot of work.
Yes.
And I think that the perception of success is that there's a roar of the crowd and you cruise. Right. You don't cruise. They just give you more to do.
Right.
Or you give yourself more to do.
Well, what I think is, at least in my life experience, and I've heard this from other people as well, you know, it's that prize that we're going for that, if we get it, is so unsatisfying. And it's the prize that we never imagined that we kind of go, well, how did that